Okay, so this lecture is Object Models in MVC3. So we'll go over some HTML5 items. We'll look at C# syntax, look at the difference between design time and runtime objects, grayed out code in Visual Studio and what that means. We'll look at a layout view. We'll look at doing styles the right way. We'll go over partial views and then a little bit about font awesome. Okay, I'm going to do a quick review of a few HTML5 types for input boxes. So let's go to the profile controller, and we're going to add in an HTML view. So we're going to add it right to the top of this. So I'm copying this index, pasting it in. We're going to just call this HTML, right? Get rid of that item. So for this, we're not going to have a post, and we're not going to have a model. So let's go ahead and create that view. Right-click, View, Add. Okay, first thing, let's change the H2. We're going to call this HTML stuff, right? All right, so let's go ahead and bring in a couple things that should look normal, right? We're going to add, we can get rid of that. We're going to add just the sum spacing. We've been using that for a couple of assignments so far. I'm just going to add a tag, add a P tag. So let's start off with this one. Okay, so pretty normal. You have divs wrapped in other divs. This class is going to have the sum spacing that we've gone over here. And again, this sum spacing, I could have named this bottom spacing or anything. So it's whatever you think makes sense. And in this case, bottom spacing might have been appropriate, but we'll leave it this. So we just have some text inside a div. So this is an input, just a traditional HTML input, and this is the razor syntax for the same type of input. Now, what makes and what I'm going to do for this whole page is I'm going to show you the syntax that's using pure HTML, and then show you the syntax that's using the HTML helpers that end up producing nearly identical HTML. So in this case, HTML.textbox, I'm calling it TXT for textbox datetime2. So this is TXT datetime1. Now the important piece is this. So the type equals datetime-local. So what that's going to do is instead of just giving us a plain input box, and typically an input box is of type text, but this one's going to be something a little different. So let's go ahead and go to the properties of the project. We're going to go ahead and go to Web tab. Instead of Profile Index, we're going to go to Profile HTML. So save that, close that tab. So when we run this, it's going to bring up this view. So let's take a look at it. Okay, so check this out. All we did was this. This is the pure HTML version. And this is, again, and in the end, it's still HTML, but this is what's produced by that razor syntax and the HTML helpers. Now, it's very much the same. If this wasn't there, the name, it would be identical. So the important part is to focus on is this type, datetime-local. So just adding that type gives you all of this functionality. I mean, just the ability to just jump through this. I couldn't imagine how many weeks and weeks it would take for you could make this, but it would take you so long. It's just incredible the functionality you get from this. And then we can call this there it is. So it's just kind of amazing. And the same thing for the other one, right? They're both the same in the end, but all of this functionality came about just because this HTML5 date time dash local. So that's pretty cool. All right, so let's grab another piece, another snippet of code. So now we're going to change this to it's the same thing, but now we're going to put a value in these text boxes. Instead of it just being blank, we're going to default values in there. So I just saved this. I'm going to go back to my browser and just hit F5 to refresh. So now I've got that same type of thing, but it's not coming in blank, right? It's coming in with some default value. Again, right click view page source, and here's the first set that we added, right? And the second set just has a value property set, right? So if you don't put a value property in here, then it just assumes it's an empty string. So it looks a little different than just a date and a time. It's doing it in reverse, and this is pretty standard for system looking date times. So anyway, this is the version that you get if you don't put a value to it, and this is what you get if you do get a value to it. Now, of course, I could go here and pick. Now, I won't do that. I'll chop that out. Okay, let's go back to our page. Let's grab another one. This one's a completely different type. Let's check this one out. This one is a type of month. Okay, so in this one, I'm going to show one just pure HTML, and then I'm going to show the other one with the razor syntax. But in this one, I'm going ahead and giving the second one a default value. So save this, go back to your browser, refresh. So now you see something pretty similar, except it's not down to the detail of picking a day and a time. This is just picking a month and a year, right? And then this is the same one. So let's go and take a look at that, view page source. So now we're down here, input text month, and the same thing here. Or, sorry, type month, and the same thing here, type month. The difference in the second one is I'm giving it a value. And again, that looks like this when you open it up. Pretty cool. Okay, let's bring in the next one. This one is pretty fantastic. So this is a type of type text, but spell check is set to true. Okay, this can be used on almost every text box. Now you wouldn't want to use it in if it's a email address or something strange phone number, you couldn't use it on there. But anything that somebody's going to type in text, this is exactly what you want. So let's go look at that. So I went ahead and pasted it in, hit save. Let's go back to the browser and F5. So check this out. Okay, that's spelled incorrectly on purpose, and so is this. So I'm going to go behind the scenes and look at the source. So again, they're just input boxes, and this time of type text, but both of them have the spell check true. See that there and here. And again, we have default values, purposefully misspelled. So when you put your cursor in there, check that out. It just tells you there's something wrong. You right click, it shows you the correct version. Same thing here, right click, shows you that. So something as simple as spell check true gives you so much power, right? This is incredible power. So let's go back in, and we're going to add another one that's similar to that one, except it's going to be a text area. Now, a text area is basically a multi-line text box. So I just pasted this in. You see what this looks like. So it's text area, spell check is true, and then we're just setting a few other properties. Rows 5, so it's going to have a height to have 5 rows in it, and just a width of 500, right? 500 pixels. Let's see, basically the same thing in the razor syntax. And I'm going to scroll over a little bit so you can see the rest. So spell check is true. Rows is 5. Style is 500 pixels wide. So that's going to give us the same. This is going to basically be the same as this one, even though this is pure HTML and this is Razor syntax. So save that. Let's go back to the browser, F5. So and if you look, before I put my cursor in there, you can see misspellings in here, right? And again, I'm doing this for to show examples. So as soon as I put my cursor in there, it's telling me all these misspellings, right? Right click, and I picked some that are easily recognizable by it. So this is a fantastic set of tools that you almost don't have to do anything to begin to use and add it into your projects. So if I go ahead and right click page view page source, again they look nearly identical. Rows 5 in both, style with 500 pixels, spell check is true in both. Pretty cool stuff. All right, a little less than normal to use. Let's add another one. Let's go back to our code. This one, we're going to add a type color. This is pretty neat looking, but it has limited usage. So I went ahead and pasted that in, hit save, go back to the browser, refresh. Now, check that out. That is just terribly cool. So you can add your own color picker, right? Again, not quite as useful as a spell check, but still pretty good. So if you right click, page source, go down and look, and they're nearly identical. So this just gives one color. I forget what the colors were by default. Again, the important part is the type of an input. The type is color in both of these, right? Pretty cool. So I'm going to refresh my page. Okay, so the first color was red, and I defaulted it. Oops, right click page source. The first one, this is the hex color for red, or at least close to red. And then blue, go back in, and this is the hex color for blue. Okay, just a couple more of these. Back to your HTML, paste. Now we're pasting in of type number. So not only is this going to be a number, but we're even going to give this a range and a step, right? So I'll show you what these will do. So again, pure HTML, and then the helper with the Razor syntax. Save that. Go back to your browser, F5. Okay, check it out. So we didn't do anything, right, for these buttons here, the up and down buttons. We didn't do anything for it. And this will only go up to what was our max? 100. So I'm not going to sit here and watch that go up to 100. I'll just do this, 99. And then I'll start going up, and it stops at 100. So there could be a lot of uses for this. I recently built a time and leave for hours worked and a system for the college, as a matter of fact. And in this, I wanted to limit this to a certain range. There's only 24 hours in a day. So when somebody said that they were working 6.5 hours, I didn't want to have to worry about, did they put 8,000 in this box? I can just limit this box from 0 to 24, and then I don't have to worry about it. So same thing. We didn't do anything differently. View page source. Again, here's the pure HTML. It's still, in the end, still an HTML input, both of them, and they still have the max, the min, the step, and then both of them have the type number. So we could change this. I'm going to go back to our code, and I'm going to change one of these to start at 10, and we'll step 10, right? So that only lets us go into intervals of 10. So let's save that. This is on the first one, remember. So I did an F5 to refresh it. So now I'm going up Check it out. It only goes up to 10. Now you still have to limit. Somebody could type in, a 4, right? And it's not increments of 10, but this just gives you the idea of what the step can be used for. So this case, it was step. Now the reason I picked a step 0.25 is because when you're doing time and logging your hours worked, normally you don't go any lower than increments of a quarter of an hour, right? So you started at 3 and finished at 7:15 or 7:45, something like that. Okay, last one of these HTML5. Now I'm not taking any time into pasting these in. When you want to take a look at these and you need more time than I'm giving you in the video, just pause it. My goal is to try to keep these videos as short as I can so you can go back in and check things. So anyway, the next one is a placeholder. Now the placeholder just gives you an idea of what you're supposed to put into the text box, right? You don't always know. So let's take a look at that. I saved it, come back, F5. So check it out. You've seen these on a lot. It could be social security numbers, it could be a phone number. This one I just put in something different just so you could see it's not just now. I'm not limiting. You can put anything in here right now. There's other techniques to limit that you can only put numbers in it, but this is just to prompt the user. So if I go back in, I'm gonna go back in and change one of these. I'm gonna say enter your first name. Save that. Go back to your page, F5 to refresh. So now it just says enter your first name. So that normally a text box like these two, they you have a label that tells you what that text box is for. But when you do this, you don't need the label anymore. Enter your first name. Now the only difference is if I do that, or say I typed that in. Well, I no longer see that hint that this box is supposed to be my first name once I start typing. So that's the drawback of not putting a tag above it. So anyway, those are the HTML input types. Let's check it out again. So date time gives you that nice, powerful date time picker. The month, if you don't need to get to a specific day and a time, then you can use the type month. Now we're back to type text, except we're turning on spell check, right? So we've got a spell check for a single line input box, and then really the same thing for a multi-line input box. It's just called a text area, right? And they both, this is the important part, right? Spell check is true. A few of these less than normal, at least with the color. This is a cool thing, just not a whole lot of things you can do with it. But again, it's of type color. We've got another one of type number, right? So I don't know if you noticed a few seconds ago, in these number ranges, I'm typing letters on the keyboard. It won't let it put in. It's only going to take in numbers. See, yeah, very good. Let me get back to the code. And then finally, let me finish this one, sorry. So you can also do things like min, max, what's the lowest you can go, what's the highest you want them to go, and then even a step. I would say most time you're going to look at a step of 1. How many times did you do this? 11. Maybe you're doing a website that counts you working out and you want to say how many reps did you do? Well, you don't do a 1.5 reps. You do 1 rep. So there's a lot of, most times in these numbers, most times it's going to be a step 1, but it all depends on what you're doing. And then finally, the placeholders. You can use these placeholders in a lot of areas. So this is I wouldn't call this a less than typical thing. The placeholder, it's got a lot of uses. Okay, to stop the project from running, go back to the profile controller. So we're going to go over some C# syntax. I know we've gone over some syntax as we've been going through some of these assignments, but I want to go through them in detail. So let's start out with some simple variable declarations. So in C#, it starts off with the data type. So int, which is just a small number. I'm going to call it I. I'm going to give it a default value of 0. Make another one. I'm going to call this int age. And I'm not going to give it a default value, but we'll see that these end up both having the exact same default value. So another one, a Boolean, right? It's true or false. So Boolean alive, we'll call it, is true. Another one, finished. I'm not going to give that a default value. So let's set a breakpoint here. Go ahead and run this. So when a breakpoint jumps in, we're going to bring up the locals. So down here, if you don't see locals, you can go to Debug, Windows, and click locals there. I already have it showing up, so I'm going to click that, and I'm going to pin it for a minute over here. So far, even though we haven't run this code, check these defaults out. They all have default values, even though we haven't even gotten that far. Simple data types like integers, booleans, longs, strings, they all have default values, even though the code hasn't executed that. So that's different than some of these other objects, and I'll get to that in just a minute. So the int I, so I'm looking at this one, already has a default value. I'm going to just step, which is F10, and it didn't even go to it didn't even break on this one because we're not setting it a value. So the compiler, the debugger won't let you step over this, or it won't let you pause it there because you're not giving it a value. But if you look down here in the locals, it still has the same value. So in ints, longs, doubles, any of these numbers, as long as they're simple data types, if you don't give it a default value, numbers have a default value of 0. Now, right now, check out this one here. So we're still sitting on that line. We haven't executed that. And Boolean alive, this variable, already has a default value of false, and so does finish. So Boolean finished, and this is just a variable I would use. I've used this variable lots of times if I'm going through a loop, or I want to say, hey, keep on doing this piece of code until something sets this Boolean finished to true, and then you'll break out. But right now, Boolean alive has a default value of false because we haven't executed this code yet. So I'm going to do a step over, and now it's got a value of true, right? Now, again, it didn't break on Boolean finish because I'm not giving it a default value, but it still has one, right? It still has one. Okay, let's stop this from running. So now we're going to go back to one of the objects that we've used. Instead of these simple data types, we're going to look at a complex data type, our user class, right? So over here in the models, so this has string values, it has other objects, and all these other objects, in this case, we're setting to null. Now there's reasons and a lot of different reasons in your software development projects that you'll work on that you want these to be null at design time. So because home address is another object, right, of type address, right, it has these values. We saw some examples that we wouldn't always use all three of these different addresses, right? Sometimes somebody doesn't have a home to address. So you want to have your code set up like this because it uses up less memory. Now, memory is something that you normally don't have to worry about nowadays because computers are so powerful. But when you're doing things that are crunching tons and tons of data, having these set to null until you want to use them is an important thing. Okay, so back to our user class. So this is setting up a new user object called U, and it's giving it a new blank object, right? Not null, but a blank object, meaning no default values in it. So I'm going to set another one. Oops. and do that, right? So let's set a breakpoint here and run this. Now I have my locals pinned, so it's still going to show. So you'll notice now you and U2 both have a value of null because we haven't actually run this. Before, these had default values, but it's because they're simple data types. And complex data types like a user object, they don't get any kind of default value. But what this is going to do is this is going to declare a U object and get it an empty blank one with all the default values that's in this user class, right? All of these are the default values, right? And with these strings, we're actually giving them values of empty string. These other objects, we're saying stay null until I want you to be something other than null. So right now, we're saying give me a fully populated blank, but fully populated structure of a U object. So right now, we haven't run that command, and it's still null. So I'm going to step over, and now you see that's changed. See, the U2 still says null. I'll get to that in just a second. But now this says it's a web2 blank.models.user object, and if you open it, you get all these properties, right? You can access these properties in your code. Now, the ones that say null, you still have to do something, and we'll get to that in a minute. But these other values you can access right away. So I'm gonna collapse that one. But this U2, because we did not give it a new command, a new one of these, right? So you're saying here is my data type, here's my variable name, and then I'm saying give me a new object of that. So that's what populates this into something in your code that you can use, right? And I'll show you what I mean by that. So let's go ahead and stop this. So if I right after this, I can say u dot first name equals Sally, right? I can do that right away. I don't get any errors. But it's because I've said give it a new object. Give it one of these and allocate space on the computer. If I were to do the same thing here, it's already telling me, it's already showing me this. The yellow, the red squiggly lines are already showing me, hey, there's a problem. And if you put your cursor over it, it says use of unassigned local variable. So it's telling you right now, you can't do this because you haven't given it a new command. Now, I could give it a new command like this, but I'm going to do it a little differently just so you see two ways of doing this. So now I still have a U2 object, but I haven't given a new command yet. So I can say U2 equals new that, right? And then I can access it just like I was doing here. So the difference is this is doing it in 2 steps, right? Why would you do it in 2 steps? Well, there's a lot of different reasons. I won't go too much into this, but it really has to do whether or not you're allocating space for this object. Now, a user object, so I'm back at the user.cs, there's not a lot of space needed for all of these objects, even if they're fully populated. But if you can think of a Toyota, right, and a car, and think of all the properties that a car would have, and all the objects. It's going to have an engine with transmission, and all these are going to have all these pieces. And then if you're doing 10,000 cars a day, so think about the space that you need to allocate if you just go in and always use this structure, right? So this is setting this as a new at design time. This is setting it as new at runtime, right? So only until we get to this part of the code, you can have all kinds of other lines of code in here. Only when you get to this part of it is when you're going to be able to start utilizing it like it is here. before this, the compiler won't even run. So if we bring this back up, right, and if I do this, boom, there, it's going to give us this error, and it won't even let us run this. So I'm going to see if it'll run it. It'll probably give us an, yeah. So it's giving us a compile error, and it's saying right there, I'm trying to use that U2 object, but it's unassigned. It hasn't gotten a new command, right? This new object. Okay. So in this case, this is the best way of handling it. So I'm going to get rid of this new one. But that's what you would, that's the purpose of always seeing this when you come to objects. So now let's go ahead and expand on that a little bit. We know we've got other objects inside here that are null at design time, meaning if I go to the class, this is design time. All these objects are all set to null, and we'll allocate those. We'll give it a new command when we're ready to use them, right? And that's saving space. So in this case, we're going to say u dot, and I'm going to make up an example. I'm going to just use home to address, right? In order for me to use that, it's already null right now. Dot address 1 equals 100 Oak Street. All right, what's going to happen here? Home to hasn't given a new command. This is going to give me an error. So let's check it out. So I was able to use, let's do this. I'm going to step over. So I can set first name and last name because I've given a new on you, and first name and last name are already have default values of empty string. So they're already allocated. Okay, so I can use that. But it's going to tell me if I go down here in the locals and expand you and look at home to address is still null. So as soon as I go to execute this statement, it's going to fail because it's trying to access a property that's inside an object that's still null. So the compiler, the Visual Studio, is saying, I don't know what address 1 is because I don't even know what home to address is, much less one of its properties, right? So I'm just going to step over this, and here's what I'm going to get. This is object reference not set to an instance of an object. You'll get tired of that because you'll see that for your whole career if you're using Visual Studio. So that's just telling you that you're trying to access this, but this hasn't been allocated yet, right? So how do we do that? So what we do is, you're probably already thinking it, u dot home address 2 equals new that, right? So now we're saying home address 2, not only is it, we're going beyond this being null, right? So again, home address 2, I'm going to bring up the user.cs, and home address 2 is null at design time right now, right? But at runtime, meaning when we execute this and somebody's hitting your website and they get to this part in your code, then we're going to give it a new address object, and then we can start accessing parts of home address, right? Like address 1, address 2, city, state, and zip. I won't go into all of them. Right, I'm just going to do those two. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and execute this. I don't need that breakpoint there. We got a breakpoint still on this one. Let's run it. And this is just part of object modeling, part of handling your code in your objects. So I'm just going to step over, right? And right now, I'm going to expand this in the locals. Right now, home to address is still null. But as soon as I execute this command, you're going to see it fully populates it fully populates an address object into home to address part of this class here. So I'm going to step over, and you'll see that changed, right? Now I can address it, even though these things are still empty string, now I can still use them in my code because I executed the new command. Okay, let's go ahead and stop the code from running. And we're going to get rid of all of this stuff because all of this is just examples, just showing you how the syntax is. So now we're going to look at an if statement, right? There can be simple if statements or very complex if statements. So I'm going to declare a Boolean. We'll do a Boolean alive, sure, why not, equals true, right? So you can have a very simple if statement. If Boolean alive, true, then do something. Well, in this case, let's add another variable here. We're going to say I'll call it count. Right. So this is almost as simple as it gets. We're going to see that this can be even simpler. So this is saying if Boolean alive is true, right? And in this case it is, right? Then we're just going to increment count by 1. So int count plus plus, that's a C and Java, that's a syntax to just say whatever this is, add 1 more to it. So in this case, our code is always going to go into this, but what I want to show you is there's an even simpler way of writing this that may not always be the most obvious, right? So now let's do that. Oops. So now this statement is saying if this equals true, okay, and you want the double equals here because you're not trying to assign this to true. You're just saying if it's true, and you have to do. If I only did one equal sign there, it would assign it to true as well, and it's not what we want. So in this case, this is saying if this Boolean alive equals true, then increment this count. So what does that mean? It's really saying evaluate this statement. Is Boolean alive equals true? Well, if it's true, what does that evaluate to? It evaluates to true and here. That's what the compiler is doing behind the scenes. So then it's saying if true, well, isn't true true? Yes, this is a confusing part. It is in every class, but it's an important piece to understand because this is really what's happening. And when you get into some of these more complex if statements, it's important to know this. So in the end, I'm gonna undo this. I'm gonna put a breakpoint here. Let's do this. Right? This is saying if this is not true, what is not true? False. Right? So let's go ahead and run this. I've got a breakpoint on this. Okay, so what is Boolean alive? I'm hovering over it, and it says right now it's true. So this is going to evaluate into true, and it's going to increment this int count, right? So I'm just going to step over that, and now int count, you'll see it down here in the locals, but it's all, you can hover over to, now int count is 1, right? So what this ended up doing is it said, this evaluates to true, and I'm going to stop this, just like, because the compiler behind the scenes does this. It says, decide what this value is. Is that true? Then it replaces those two with the word true, with the value true. And then if true, which if true is yes, then int count is incremented. So let's compare that to this. And I'm gonna change this for a minute. So now we're just saying if Boolean alive is false, right? I'm going to run this. So if Boolean alive is false, then increment the count. Well, it's not going to be able to increment the count because Boolean alive is not. So I'm going to F10 once, twice, and now it's going to evaluate this. Boolean alive is set to true now. It's not false, so it's not going to come in and increment this to 2. See that? It jumped right past it. But what happened behind the scenes? Behind the scenes, this said, if Boolean alive equals false, what does that equal? What does Boolean alive equal? If Boolean alive is false, this is false, right? Because Boolean alive equals true. So this statement, Boolean alive equals false, turns into the value false. So because it's false, this never gets evaluated. So this is going to take a minute. So hold tight. So now we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to look at this statement. So we're going to make a little more complex statement here. We're going to say if Boolean alive equals true and count equals 0, right? I'm going to comment this out just for a minute. So now I'm looking at a little bit more complex statement, right? So let's go ahead and run it. So now in order to increment int count, both of those values have to end up being true, right? If Boolean alive is true and, right, that's the important part, and int count is 0, right? So if I hover over it, it's obvious Boolean alive is true and int count is 0, so it's going to jump and do the if statement. But what's really happening here? What's really happening behind the scenes is it evaluates this first, right? And we saw that Boolean alive equals true. So the compiler takes that, what I've got highlighted right there, and it puts the value of true over top of it. Okay. Then it evaluates this statement, int count. If int count equals 0, well, in our example, it does. So what does that equal? True. And this is exactly what the compiler is doing behind the scenes. And I know you just have to think this way because this is how logic is done inside your code. So now we've got if true and true. Well, what's two trues, right? Two trues is always true in an and statement. So these can get replaced with the value true. So this says if true, then increment that. So it's important to know how the compiler breaks these statements down. It really does. It evaluates this, figures out whether or not Boolean alive is true, and if it is, it puts true there. Same thing in this other one. If int count is true, if int count equals 0, and if it does, it puts the word true there. Then it evaluates further and says true and true is always true, right? True and false ends up being false, right? So in this case, true and true, the compiler does that. And finally, it gets down to one value, and then it says, oh, okay, let's go ahead and do this. So I'm going to undo this a little bit. So now let's look at it in a way where it won't equal, it won't go into this. Okay, so let's say int count is 1, right? So what's going to happen is it's going to come in here. I don't even need to set the breakpoint. It's going to come in here and says, is Boolean alive true? Well, it is here, right? Let's go ahead and put a breakpoint and run this. Okay, so right now, Boolean alive is true, and int count is 0. So it's not gonna do this statement, right? We'll just execute it just so we see. So it definitely didn't do that. So what's happening behind the scenes, right? It's evaluating this, and this is true. Boolean alive is set to true. So it replaces it with the true value. Then it says, is int count a 1? An int count is not a 1 in this case. So it goes and it does that. So what is the value of true and false? Well, because it's an and, that means both of these have to be true. So the value of true and false in this case is going to be false, right? So it always gets down to one value eventually, just like this. It'll figure out a value for this one and put that value true there. And then it'll figure out if this is accurate, if this is right. It'll put a true there. But eventually it gets down to one value. Is this statement true or false in the end? And if it does, it executes this. So that's what we started with. Okay, so now let's take a look at the same if statement, but instead of being ands, we're going to change it to or, right? So now this is completely different. Now only one side has to be true. So either Boolean alive is true or int count is 1. If either one of those is, then it will increment this variable. So what's going to happen is this is going to evaluate into true, right? Because we know that value is true. So the compiler is going to do that. Then it's going to say, is int count equal 1? Well, nope, int count is 0. So it's going to do this. But true or false evaluates to true. And this will end up getting executed. Let me back those off. Let's go ahead and run that. So right now, only one of these sides have to evaluate. So alive equals true. So this will get, if the compiler will evaluate this first and put a true in its place. And then it's going to look at this and say what it is, int count is 0. Well, int count is not 1. So this part gets a false. So again, true or false ends up evaluating to true. So it's going to jump to this line and execute this code. And there it does, right? Okay, go ahead and stop it from running. So let's expand the syntax. So instead of doing it like this, we're going to say if Boolean alive is true. Let me get rid of this for a minute. Else. So if Boolean alive is true, this is a simple way of an if statement, an if else statement in this case. If Boolean alive is true, if Boolean alive equals true, int count plus plus. So just increment that variable. Otherwise, let's just, we're going to say int count equals 0. All right, so I'm going to do this. So somewhere in the code, we just imagine that we've changed this int count into something big, right? Right. So it's got a value, not that. It's got a value right now. So now it's going to come in and do an if else. Now this is just showing a simple case for an if else, a one-liner if else. Okay, if you have more than one line of code, you have to put the curly brackets in it. So if I want to do a one-liner if statement, really just like this one, right? I want to take this bracket out and that bracket out. It gets upset for a minute, but it knows, oh, there's only one statement inside this if. The brackets are optional. Okay, so as long as you only have one, the brackets are optional. I'm going to add these back in. But up here, that looks a whole lot nicer to not have to have the brackets. So let's compare what that would look like. There. there, there. Got to get rid of that one. So that's what the code looks like with the brackets. Just a little more involved, right? It takes a couple more lines of code up. So I would say I regularly, when I know I have simple if statements, I don't put the brackets in. It just makes your code smaller. Okay, so if you need more than one line, then of course you can't do the simple case here. So let's go add all these back. So we've got it. Okay, so this is how if you need more case. So maybe int count plus plus, and then maybe you're going to do something like this equals false. Just another statement. It doesn't matter what it is. So now, I couldn't remove this curly braces because I've got more than one line. Down here, it's still optional. This is still optional. So if I wanted to, and I typically don't, once I commit to the curly brackets, once I have more than one line in, I put them in for all of them because it just looks a little odd. But again, this can continue. So let's say else if something else, right? So else if let's do this. We're going to change this. Okay, so now we're saying if Boolean alive is false, do this stuff. Okay, well, we know it's not going to be false. So then we're saying, okay, well, if Boolean alive isn't false, then if int count is some number, and I'm just making it a thing up, then we're going to do this. So then we're going to say, maybe we want to say, okay, once we reach here, the logic isn't important, but once we reach here, we're going to say we're going to put this back to 0, right? So now we've got an if statement, an else if statement, and then an else. Now you can continue to make additional else if statements forever. And there's a lot of times I've had maybe a dozen or two else ifs. A lot of times once I get that big, I'll change it into a switch statement. But it all depends on the thing that you're looking to do. So this is just showing a more complex if statement or multi-line if else if and else statement. And again, even though once you get to 2 lines in an if statement, you have to put the curly braces. But even though this has 1 line, I could go without the curly braces, but it's just not standard practice. All right, so we are going to get rid of every bit of that. We're going to take a look at the switch statement. We used it over in our database class, so I'm going to grab this. You don't have to copy it. I'm going to shrink this up quite a bit. Okay, so there's a lot of you'll see a lot of complaints about switch statements. In my view, these breaks should be inside the case else, but they just aren't. So I've got to suck it up and quit complaining about it because I do every chance I get. So we're going to say we're going to declare an integer value int age, right? And we're going to give it an age equals, we're going to call it 20, right? So this is going to evaluate whether or not the age of this person, right? So in this case, this is going to have a value of 20. But maybe you're going to allow this person to say case 16, right? If their age is 16, do this stuff, right? And you can picture some of the things that you might want to do. If they're 18, do this stuff. If they're 21, do this stuff. I'm going to go ahead because I know that once you get to 25, you pretty much can do anything. So I'm going to say 25, and then default is everything else. right? So that's what the default is. So if it comes in, I didn't complete my switch. Okay, so your switch statement can be switch statements and if statements oftentimes are interchangeable because you can see you can see if age is 16, else if age is 18, else if age is 21, else if age is 25. But there's a lot of uses for switch statements. In this example, an if then else would work, but this is how the switch is set up. So you have switch in bracket in parentheses, and then each case just has the syntax is a colon behind it. And it's going to do this work, whatever work that you do in here. You could have hundreds of lines of code in here, right? Could be all kinds of things. But eventually, you're going to get to the bottom of the work you want to do. And if you don't want to continue to evaluate these other values, you have to put a break in. So all of these are like that. Now, there are times, not many, but there are times that I've didn't need to put the breaks in, but almost always you'll see a switch statement have the breaks in. It's pretty rare that you'll see a switch statement without these breaks. So just so I'm going to execute this. Right. So right now we've got a value. So I'm going to say only if this value is 25 am I going to set Boolean this to true. So I think this is still a thing. You can't rent a car until you're 25. So so this value won't get set. It won't get set to true unless this is 25. So I'm going to set it to 25 just so we see this happen. I'm going to set my breakpoint there. Go ahead and run this. Okay, I'm stepping over now. So it's executing it, but it's so step over. Now it's jumping. It's going to evaluate. Switch is a case statement, so it's going to evaluate this integer 25. Now, if this is one of these values, it'll jump in, and in this case, of course, it's going to jump down to the 25. But what it does after that is it hits that break, does not go into here, and jumps out of that statement. Okay, so the last part of this, I'm going to go ahead and stop this from running. The last part of this, I'm going to go into why now. Years back, Visual Studio wouldn't have done this. So you see these two using statements. They have a lighter color, right? It's doing that because we're not, even though we're including these libraries, and that's what this is. This is a code library. All of these are code libraries, so we can do work with things inside these objects. So Visual Studio will show you when you don't need something, it'll turn it to a lighter shade of that color. So right now it's telling us you're not using links or system.web. And really you should take them out. It would let you leave them in here. It's not a compile error, and you can publish your code and there's nothing wrong with it, other than your code base when you compile it is bigger. Even though you're not using these, you're compiling these libraries into your project, so your project ends up being bigger and it takes up more space. So in this case, I'm going to delete these, right? Okay, so we're going to get rid of this select statement or this switch statement here. All right, so I want to go back to one more. I'm going to continue on the way Visual Studio will make something dimmed in color to give you a hint that you don't need it. So in the case of we'll say models.useru equals new, right? So I could expand on this a little bit to make it to make a scenario that shows how Visual Studio will change that into a lighter color. So if you ever see this and you can even hover it over. It says name can be simplified. You'll see this more as we go through the project, go through this course. There'll be times when you can say, this is more explicit because our project is Web 2. So Web 2.models.user, but it's telling you, go ahead and get rid of that. You don't need it because we're already in the namespace Web 2 blank. That's the reason why you don't really need that. So this just says, make your code shorter because shorter code is always easier to read. Okay, so there are what I've been doing in the class. So I'm back at the HTML, HTML.cs HTML file, and I've been, I would say I'm doing air quotes, so I'm breaking some rules here a little bit, and they're not hard, fast rules. But you'll notice this sum spacing, right? I've used this in a lot of places, right? This is the index for the profile. That's got the exact same variable and the exact same property. The properties view, that's got the same one. The user address has the same one. This is very inefficient. Now, if you think of just a complex website, think of Amazon.com and think of all the places that they want to make sure a button looks exactly like every button on the site. They would never put the CSS for that button on the individual pages, because if they decided, well, we're going to change our buttons to not have round edges, we want square edges. You're like, oh my gosh, it's on 25,000 pages. So of course they would never do that. But this is the reason why you want to stay away and use your style sheet as much as you possibly can. So in this case, this sum spacing, right? I'm going to copy this. I'm over my Solution Explorer. Under Content, I've got a site.css. Go ahead and open that up. We're going to add that. I'm going to make sure I don't have it here already. I don't. We're going to add that to this, right? So now this is controlled by the site.css, and I don't have to define it in all of these other places. Matter of fact, I want to delete it in all these other places. Matter of fact, I can delete that whole style there. Same thing here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to search my site and see where this shows up. Matter of fact, I want to really see where the dot shows up. Okay, Hello Index still has it, right? So I'm going to go to Hello Index. I didn't open up that one. That one only has the sum spacing in it, so I'll go ahead and delete the styles tags as well. Okay, so now just to be completely sure, sum spacing, find all, it's only in the site.css. So it's only defined once in our style sheet. And that style sheet, if you open up in the Solution Explorer, open up the shared folder and open up the layout view, that is added to the layout view. Now in MVC, the layout view is your primary page setup, and this render body, that's what only the individual HTML. So when this whole page is finished and it renders down to the end user, to the browser, it replaces this piece of code right here. So everything in your views, so I'll go back to the HTML view. So everything inside this, once this is finished, gets dumped right on top of this render body. So all the HTML above it remains the same, and all the HTML below it remains the same. And that view body gets rendered right in this spot. So that's what the layout is. But I brought this up to show you that we're already including the site.css in our layout page. So all of those pages, all of those views that had that sum spacing defined no longer does, but you're going to see that sum spacing is still being applied because now we've got it defined inside our site.css. And I'm just going to take this breakpoint off and let this run. So all of these have spacing underneath it, right? If it didn't, then they wouldn't be there. So I'm gonna do something. So leave this running for a minute. I'm gonna go back to my site.css, and I'm gonna change the name of this. Right? I'm just changing it to a name that won't work. We'll call this now it's broken, right? So I save it. Now, right now, I still have this page is sitting here. It's already had that site.css applied and put the some spacing below each one of these, right? And if I right click, go to page source, each one of these is using that class some spacing. So at the bottom of this, it's going to put that 1em of space margin bottom, right? Let's go back to that real quick and take a look at that. So margin bottom, I changed this name. I'm going to leave it to this, but it was some spacing, right? So I want it to break, but it's only placing a margin bottom at the end of these, right? So all of these that had that some spacing in it, once I go to refresh my page, there's not going to be any margin bottom to the bottom of this div, right? So that's what that style is. It's only doing one thing, margin bottom. Some of these styles are way more complex than that, but in this case, it's just got one property. So every one of these at the bottom of, after this div, it's going to put a margin of 1em below every one that has that. So now what I did is I went back to my code and I changed in the site.css, I just changed this name, right? And I saved it. So what it's going to do is it's going to break this margin bottom. So I'm going to come back to my page and hit F5 to refresh, and it shoves everything back up because this page, right click, view source, this page is looking for something called some spacing, right? And it's a class and not an ID. So a class, we go back to our style sheet, where'd you go? Here, is a dot, right? So anytime you use a class, it's a dot. If you're using a pound, it's an ID, a hashtag. So right now, I changed the name of that style, and then I went back to my page and refreshed it, and all of these lost that margin bottom, right? So that's just showing you what happens when you do that. So I'm going to fix this and put it back to some spacing. The same name, this page is now it's still looking for that some spacing, but now it's defined. Before I changed the name and it wasn't in my style sheet, so I couldn't do anything with it. So now I'm going to hit F5 and then the some spacing is applied. All right, let's go ahead and stop this from running. For the next part of this lecture, I'm going to introduce the concept of a partial view. So you remember what a view is. A view basically shows everything on this page. Well, there are times that you want to be able to display and reuse just a partial part of a page. So I'll give an example. So let's go ahead and inside the profile controller, let's right click, click add MVC partial, MVC5 partial page razor. And we're going to call this a card. Just click OK. Okay, so again, a partial page is just a particular spot on a web page, just this one little area, and maybe that spot is on 50 different pages in your website. Well, you don't want to have to duplicate that code 50 different times in all your different websites. So that's what a partial page will help you do. So in this case, we're going to say that this partial page is still going to use our user model. Okay, so I'm going to let you see some code here. I'm going to let you type this in. So go ahead and pause the video and type this CSS in. You may not have to pause it. So what we're going to have is we're going to have an ID of a div, right? That's what the pound says. This is going to an ID rather than when we showed the some spacing, we have a dot there. A dot is saying we're going to use it in the class part of your HTML. But when you see a pound sign or hashtag, that means it's an ID. So this says there's some kind of HTML item called that's got an ID of card-box. So some of the properties, it's got a background color of a certain hex color, display inline block, padding. It's going to have a 1M on everything on the inside. A margin is everything on the outside. Okay, it's going to have a border, text align, round edges, and then when I hover over it, it's going to change the background color a little bit and make the border black instead of gray. Okay, so that's the HTML, and I'm not going to get too deep in what this is. So go ahead and add this to your code as well. Here's the ID, right? So I mentioned before, whenever you see a pound in your styles, it's always associated with something that has an ID. When it's got a dot in your style, we go back to my site.css, like this one, it's got dot spacing. I'm going to close this. Then I expect to see it in a class of a div or a span or whatever structure that you have. Okay, so you'll see this. I haven't talked much about this yet, so I'm going to introduce that now. So bring up your layout view, and inside at the top of your layout view, you're going to want to add this script right underneath the title, and you'll type this in exactly, right? So this is a library with a company called Font Awesome. And Font Awesome is really awesome. It gives you images that to include in your website, but they're really not images. They're actually a font. So in this case, see that letter there? That's a C. It's just a picture of something, right? It just happens to have that shape, but it's a picture of something. That's the way Font Awesome works. So anyway, I'll get to the Font Awesome in just a minute. Just make sure you have this inside your layout, just underneath the title and above the site.css. So have this in your layout page. Okay, so we've got one div, right? And it's got an ID of card box. It'll be a little more obvious when I go over this, but all it's going to do is show the it's going to show this picture. I'll show you what this is in just a minute, but it's going to display the user's name, and then it's going to display one of their phone numbers, right? So as a matter of fact, it's going to display it as long as cell phone is not null, it's going to display the cell phone. If cell phone is null, but home phone is not null, it's going to display the home phone. Same thing, if work phone is not null, it's going to display the work phone, but it's only going to do one of these because this is in an if statement. So, right, so if cell phone is there, it'll display it. So this is in a partial page, right? A partial view. Okay, so that's everything for this view. You may have to pause this just so you can type it all in. So again, it's just a small part. It could be a big part, but it's just one part of a page that you might use in lots of different areas. So you don't want to have to rewrite your code and just continue to duplicate the same code. So now if you look at, we'll go back to the properties. So bring up your properties.cs.html. And we're going to go down to, let me find this on my other one here. And we're going to add this partial page just under the buttons. So inside the begin form, under these buttons, we're going to add this little snippet of code right there. So again, this is in the properties.cs.html, which is inside the profile controller. We just added this one line of code, right? This is html.partial, and it's giving the partial name, right, which is our card here. Sorry about that. And then it's also going to give it a model. Now, a matter of fact, it's this model, right? So we're just saying the model used in this page, in this view, which is that, it's going to pass into the card. Now, if you go back to the card.cshtml, you'll see that it has the model at the top. So this card is expecting a user object just like this properties is expecting a user object. And then it's passing that user object into this partial. Okay, so we're going to bring up, let's see, where else do I want to use this? So let's go ahead and just run this for the property. So go ahead and go back to the properties of your Solution Explorer. So under Web2 blank, double click on properties. We're going to go profile index instead of HTML. Save that and close that tab. So go ahead and run this. And we'll see that partial view in action. So it's going to go back to the original profile index view. Yep. And then we pick something and then set ID. Okay, check it out. So now this is here. So just think of a context card. That's the reason I named this card. So in a profile, you have a context card. It's just a general name for something that sort of looks like a card, usually has your picture, but I'm just using a font awesome picture that looks like a picture. And then displaying some information about you, right? And you'll see I've got some style assigned to it. So when I hover over it, the border turns black and the background color turns a little blue color from a gray color. So that's now using that partial view inside the properties view, right? So if I go back to that, I'm in properties here, still running, and that's where I added that code. So now we're going to add it to a couple other views. Okay, let's go ahead and stop this from running. Let's go ahead and bring up the profile controller and scroll down to your properties action result. We're going to copy that because we're going to use basically that exact same thing. So paste it in. So now you have two for a minute. It will error. But on the top one, call this anything. I call it anything, right? Why not? So I'll go over what this is doing in just a minute. It's really not that important. But we're also going to need a view for that. So right click on that, click add view, click add. Put our normal user object. So this is the model for this view, right? We want to do what we have been doing and changing the H2 tag to use whatever's up here. Go ahead and just put some kind of P tag in here just because that's kind of typical, right? And I usually just sort of make it look like it because you usually got a couple sentences at the top of your page telling you what to do with that page. But after that, we're going to add the partial view, right? So that's all we add. Let's go and run this. So select any one of these and hit set ID. So this is showing the context card, that partial view on the profile properties, right? So now let's go to profile anything and check it out. That exact same thing is now showing here, right? But all we did, let's go back to our code. All we did was added that, right? So now instead of duplicating everything, let me get this out of the way. Instead of duplicating all of this, and say you might use a site. I built a website 3 years ago that I used this exact thing. I had probably 30 web pages that use this exact same section of HTML. And without doing this, I would have had to duplicate all of that. So why does that matter? What matters, because if you decide that you don't want a background color of that, then you got to go to all those other 27, whatever I said, web pages and change it individually. That's a bad practice, right? So what this is doing, this is allowing you to just have one partial page defined, which is what this card is. You have a partial page defined, and then you can just use it in your different places. And we've used it where inside properties, we used it inside user address, and then we used it inside this anything, right? And that's all we did to have to make that work. So it's pretty cool. Okay, so just to close this loop, I came back here and I said I'd come back to what this is doing. It's really not doing anything special. This anything is just doing the same thing. The anything view is doing the same thing as a properties view. So I just needed to get the same code. So it would go and get a model. It would expect this route. Remember the route values ID. It expected that to to be there like it is. So if I go to anything, there's that value there, and then it goes and gets the from the db.user. It does the same code as the properties, gets a particular user, returns that into this U object, and then returns this to the view. Okay, I'm going to briefly go over Font Awesome. I mentioned that earlier in this lesson. So if you go back to the card.cshtml, you'll see this section here. So this is just an I tag, which typically can be a bullet, but this shows here is the Font Awesome image, and I kind of did that in air quotes because these aren't images at all. They're just fonts that look like images. So if you go to fontawesome.com, right, you can go in and you can search for user alt because I want to get the one that we're using in this card partial view, right? So fa-user-alt. So if I type user alt, this is the one that I selected. And they make a lot of them two-tone. So this will be two-tone. This is two-tone. This is just the dark inside. This is the light on the inside. And this is a thinner set of lines on those. So I picked this one. And you can see what this shows. So this shows, if I copy it, I click on this just to copy to the clipboard, but it's showing the FA user alt. So when I go back in and look at that, so let's go ahead and let this run. And when it gets to this section here, it's going to show that the image of a silhouette, right? Kind of as a generic user, right? That's what this font is. So if you go back to your project and bring up the layout view in the shared folder layout, so you'll see that's what this library gives us. So we're getting a jQuery library, and it's allowing us to be able to use these Font Awesome images in our websites. So we included this in our layout, and then anywhere we can access just putting in this code like this because we have the library inside our layout view, right? The library is defined there. So when I use this anywhere, the browser knows what to do with it, and it shows the correct font. So let's go back and find something else. Let's find something that's emergency, right? So they don't have endless of these Font Awesome images, but they do have quite a bit. So I'll pick just to pick something different. Let's pick this one. So when I click on it, just go click on that to copy it to the clipboard. And then I can go back to my card, and instead of using that one, I'm going to use this. Whoops. And you'll notice there's a couple of things. This FA4X, that's just a class name for Font Awesome. Make it 4 times the normal size. So we'll do the same thing with this emergency. I'm going to paste that there. FA4X. oops, I don't remember the syntax. Yeah, FA4X, FA-4X. Okay, if let's go ahead and make this 9X. Let's go ahead and save this. I'm just going to go back to my browser now and refresh. And it's going to be bigger, and it's going to have a different image, a different font in there, specifically a different font, awesome font. There it is. So I made it bigger with the 9X, and I said, give me this hospital icon. Of course, that's not what we want, but I just wanted you to see that's how easy these are to add. And I'm just pressing Control Z to undo those changes because I want to keep it back to the Alt.